Well, the Climate Action Summit is currently underway at the United Nations in New York, and correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease is standing by. We since have re-established connection with him, and we cross over to him right now. Sherwin, a very good evening to you. It's over to you.
Simpiwe, thank you very much indeed. And as you correctly point out, the Climate Action Summit convened by Secretary General Antonio Guterres still very much underway. I'm just looking to the screen to my left, and the King of Eswatini is currently at the podium talking. But in the studio here at the United Nations, I am joined by South Africa's representative to that Climate Action Summit, Environment Minister, also responsible for Forestry and Fisheries, Barbara Creecy. Minister, very warm welcome to the United Nations.
Thank you. And greetings to all the listeners at home.
And the viewers no doubt. A great deal of energy we saw in that opening session earlier today, right? Particularly from the younger generation, the likes of Swedish activist Greta Thunberg. I know that you were in the room when she was speaking. How did that hit you? Because we've done a story on this earlier, and the reaction we're getting is that people are really sort of shaken up by what this young activist said. How did you feel and respond to that moment?
It was a very emotional moment. I think particularly when she spoke about the fact that she should be at school and we should be taking responsibility for this global problem of climate change. Very, very emotional moment in that room.
They always talk about, world leaders often talk about the convening power that the United Nations still has today, right? Despite all the problems and perhaps the challenges it faces in organs like the Security Council and others, in terms particularly of sort of the intractable conflicts that face the world. But in terms of that convening power, is it translating into the actions that we seek on the ground, particularly as we talk now about this issue of climate change? Does getting these people in the room actually mean something at the end of the day?
Well, this problem can't be solved by any one country acting on its own. It's a global problem. It requires leadership from multilateral institutions. So I think the call by the Secretary General for countries to raise their ambition in dealing with this problem is a very significant call and very important in terms of getting that collective world action.
It's not just being called a climate change summit, it's being called a climate change action summit. The reason the SGS called it that is because the Paris Climate Change Agreement, in terms of the commitments and the national determined contributions that countries have committed to, gets us to about a temperature rise of about 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. That's what science says that's not good enough. We need to get that to 1.5 degrees Celsius or lower. And this is why there's been this sort of energetic call for countries to come here, not make speeches, but really come with deliverables and raised ambition. I wonder what South Africa's trajectory looks like in terms of what they are seeking to do, right? They've called for no new power stations that are fueled by coal from 2020. They've called for carbon neutral economies by 2050. Of course, South Africa faces a developmental context. What does our trajectory look like in terms of the ambitions that are being sought here?
Well, obviously we have a particular problem in our country as a developing country, primarily faced by problems such as inequality, unemployment, poverty, and a situation where at the moment we are dependent, 80% of our electricity comes from coal-powered fire stations. So obviously the fundamental issue is how do we get more renewable energy into our mix, and we are looking forward when the Minister of Minerals and Energy releases the Integrated Resource Plan later this year. We're looking forward to a significant increase in renewables. But what we also understand is that as we move towards a greater energy mix with renewables, we have to do that in a way that doesn't leave anybody behind. And that's where this concept of the just transition comes in. How do we move forward in a way that on the one hand maintains energy security? You would know that we have a problem around energy security in our country. We also have a problem around access. We still have 20 to 25% of households that don't yet have access to electricity for lighting and cooking. And clearly we've got to be moving in this transition in a way that is responsible, both in terms of our commitments as a global citizen, but also in terms of our own people. We don't want hundreds of thousands of people thrown out on the street
Sure.
because of the changes that are coming. But on the other hand, we also understand that climate change is everyone's issue. It's impacting now on our citizens. We've seen extreme weather events, the floods last year, the cyclone in Mozambique, the terrible drought that we had in the Western Cape, which continues today in parts of the Eastern Cape. So obviously we have to be taking action now to adapt to climate change, and we also have to be making our contribution to mitigate release of carbon gases.
And there's also the role of the international community, particularly the developed countries, when we talk about a just transition, right? The terminology they used in terms of the negotiations around the SDGs and the negotiations around Paris was common but differentiated responsibilities. We're all in this together, but countries have different responsibilities. To what extent, I know the Europeans are better than the Americans on this, but to what extent have developed countries come to the party to help the least developed countries, the small island states, the developing countries that need help in terms of technology transfers, in terms of financing? South Africa has a coastline of almost 3,000 kilometers, rising sea waters. How are we going to stay above water, in a sense? What are you seeing from the developed world in that respect?
Well, one of the important calls that we would be making as a country is for the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund. As developing countries, we would want to see a target of $100 billion
annually from 2020
of
annually.
That fund.
Right.
What I think we are really welcoming is that there are a range of countries that would include some of the European countries, Scandinavian countries, Germany and so on, that have already pledged to double their contribution. But I think that there would be other countries that other developed countries, we'd be very concerned that they would be ducking their responsibilities. Now, why does that matter for us as South Africans? We are going to have to take a whole range of measures in order to enable our population to adapt to climate change. So even if we are only seeing a 1.3% increase in temperature, we know that Southern Africa is one of those places where a global average of 1.5% is going to mean a 3 to 4% increase in temperature in our own country. So that's going to mean water...
Percent or degree?
Degree.
Right.
That's going to mean that water is going to become increasingly scarce. It means that we can expect more extreme weather events. So who is going to pay for the damage that flooding is going to do? Who is going to pay to make sure that we have water security in the many parts of our country that are going to become drier? How are we going to invest in our wetlands, our river courses, to make sure that we are mitigating the effects of climate change? We are already using our own resources to increase afforestation because that helps. We are clearing alien vegetation out of our wetlands. We have a whole program to work on fire. These are all things that the South African government is funding. We have had some support already from the Green Climate Fund in terms of retrofitting Medupi Power Station with special filters that can take sulfur pollutants, sulfur and nitrate pollutants out of the atmosphere. Now, this kind of technology is very expensive,
sure.
And we obviously need support, not just in terms of the existing power stations, but we also need to be making sure that as we are investing in renewables, we need to be locating those power stations in Mpumalanga, where some of the old coal-fired power stations are scheduled to be closing over the next 5 to 10 years.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Of course, Greenpeace earlier this year released a study identifying Mpumalanga as one of the pollution hotspots of the world, given the burning of these old coal power stations in that area. Just talk a little bit about that transition that you seek there.
Well, obviously, one of the issues in Mpumalanga is the sulfates and nitrates that I've spoken about already. That technology to retrofit is very expensive, and it requires finances that Eskom doesn't have at the moment. But obviously a whole range of production processes in industry and that would include private companies like Sasol. It would also include mining companies. All of those companies are creating particulate matter, what we would call dust.
And that has health concerns as well, right? Because people are breathing this dust.
Yes, that is raising health concerns. So it's very important that we need to be containing those pollutants so that people enjoy the kind of rights that they have in terms of our constitution.
We're also talking about a fundamental shift in how the energy generation works in South Africa, are we not? Which is a fundamental part of our economy, because coal is a natural resource in South Africa. So how does that shift away from coal over the longer term? They're talking about carbon neutral economies by 2050. What does that pathway, in terms of our reliance on coal, look like? How do we change course of this big ship with many, many containers on it, right?
Well, there is already discussion in the Eskom Sustainability Task Team on setting up a $11 billion transformation transaction. So it's a blended finance facility that would be available so that we can move towards more renewables. Clearly, you would be wanting to make sure that as you set up those renewables, they are facilities that could be socially owned, they could be owned by Eskom itself. They need to be located in the Mpumalanga Highveld, where some of those old stations will be decommissioned over the next 10 years.
So that we don't then face an unemployment problem in that
Absolutely.
region.
And obviously if they are socially owned or if they are being managed by Eskom, the transition of workers would be much easier.
What's the role here of the private sector? It sounds like government needs a lot of help here, right? And we talk about a green economy and the shift towards a green economy. This surely is an opportunity for businesses to get engaged. To what extent are you engaging with businesses as a department, and to what extent is that happening already?
Well, I think what's important to understand is when we talk about the impacts of climate change on the economy, we're not just talking about the energy sector. There has been a study done on the what they call a national economic vulnerability assessment, and that is identifying 7 sectors of the economy that will be vulnerable to climate change, either because, like agriculture, ecotourism, the biodiversity economy, they will be directly affected.
Sure.
Or like mining, heavy industry, they will be impacted on by higher electricity costs, and they need to develop new technology so that they have cheaper production processes that use less water, less electricity.
Well, as the SG said, I think in his remarks, I think I'm probably misquoting him, but the hole is so big we need to stop digging, right? I mean, I think that was the point. Final question for you, Minister. We talked off camera earlier. You said that this is an esoteric issue in South Africa, or it's not an esoteric issue. Which one was it?
Well, I think that the important message is that climate change is everyone's issue. It's going to affect all of our lives. It's already impacting on all of our lives, whether it's through drought, through water scarcity, through the 3.5 million jobs in agriculture and ecotourism that face challenges as a result of climate change, because it's all of our issues. We all need to start to become aware of our own behavior. How much water do we use? How much electricity do we use? How much waste are we creating?
But a difficult message really to translate to the poorest of the poor in our country, surely.
I think it is a difficult message, but I think that those who are living under conditions of poverty are the ones that are going to be most impacted on by environmental degradation and climate change. And I think that we need to help people to understand why they will be facing those challenges, but also as government and as civil society, we need to be assisting them to invest in a more secure future.
Well, I would argue you are faced with one of the most challenging and important portfolios in our government. Thank you for joining us, and good luck to you.
Thank you.
Barbara Creecy is, of course, South Africa's Minister of Environment, responsible also for fisheries and forests in our country, speaking to us here on the sidelines of the Secretary-General's Climate Change Action Summit in New York. Simpiwe, it's back to you and the team in Johannesburg.